"Step aside," Dr. Marcus Whitfield said, not looking up from the patient in front of him. "This isn't a situation that requires a nurse's opinion." He was talking to Charlotte Hale, and the wounded man on the table between them, unconscious and critical, was about to regain consciousness just long enough to say 4 words that would make Whitfield's certainty collapse in front of the entire trauma team. "I need Lieutenant Hale." Charlotte Hale was 29 years old, 5'7", with long, golden blonde hair she wore pulled back into a low, loose braid during shifts. The specific, effortless kind of beauty that made people assume, incorrectly and immediately, that she had gotten wherever she was through charm rather than competence. Her eyes were a clear, striking blue, wide and expressive in a way that made her look, to people who didn't know her well, considerably softer and more easily rattled than she actually was. She had a habit, in high-pressure situations, of speaking in a calm, quiet register that some colleagues mistook for uncertainty, when in fact it was the precise opposite, the specific, trained stillness of someone who had learned, a long time ago, that panic never once made a crisis easier to manage. She had worked at Brennan Memorial Hospital for just under 2 years, arriving with an employment file that described her prior experience only as specialized trauma care in a military-adjacent capacity. Vague enough that the hiring committee had assumed, without pushing for specifics, that she'd worked in some kind of unconventional but legitimate civilian setting. Nobody had asked further questions, and Charlotte had never volunteered more, because the specifics belonged to a chapter of her life she had spent considerable effort learning to carry quietly rather than erase entirely. What her file did not say, what almost nobody at Brennan Memorial knew, was that Charlotte Hale had spent 7 years as a Navy officer, the final 4 as a trauma medicine liaison embedded directly with a Navy SEAL platoon, deployed across multiple combat theaters, responsible for coordinating and delivering frontline medical care in conditions that made even Brennan Memorial's worst trauma nights look, by comparison, remarkably survivable. She had held the rank of lieutenant at the time of her separation from active duty, earned through a combination of exceptional field performance and a specific, rare composure under fire that had made her, within her platoon, one of the most trusted medical officers any of the operators had ever served alongside. She had left the Navy 2 years earlier, not from any single catastrophic failure, but from the accumulated weight of watching men she'd grown to genuinely care about walk into danger again and again, some of them not walking back out, until she had needed, more than anything, a version of medicine where the stakes, while still profoundly real, didn't carry quite the same operational finality she'd spent years absorbing. Her civilian life, in the 2 years before Reyes's arrival, had settled into a specific, deliberate rhythm she had built with the same careful precision she brought to everything else. She lived alone in a small, tidy apartment 15 minutes from the hospital, kept her long blonde hair in the same low, practical braid she'd worn throughout her Navy years, and filled her hours outside of shifts with a quiet, unremarkable routine, swimming most mornings at a nearby community pool, a habit carried forward from her competitive years as a teenager, and reading considerably more than she watched television, the specific, absorbing escape of fiction offering a kind of rest that little else in her life reliably provided. She had found, in her 2 years at Brennan Memorial, an unexpected comfort in the ordinary rhythms of civilian emergency medicine, appreciating the specific, uncomplicated satisfaction of patient care, unburdened by the particular emotional weight that had defined her years embedded with the platoon. She had built a small number of genuine friendships among her civilian colleagues, careful but real, and had allowed herself, gradually, to believe that the quiet life she'd constructed might actually prove sustainable rather than simply a temporary respite before circumstances eventually demanded her old capabilities again. She had found that quieter version at Brennan Memorial. She had not expected it to survive very long past the morning a wounded man was wheeled into her trauma bay with a gunshot wound so severe that Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the hospital's most senior trauma surgeon, would spend the better part of 10 minutes making decisions that were, in ways he didn't yet understand, catastrophically wrong. Dr. Marcus Whitfield was 52 years old, Brennan Memorial's chief of trauma surgery, a man whose reputation had been built over 2 decades on a combination of genuine surgical skill and an equally genuine, unexamined certainty that his judgment, once formed, rarely benefited from outside input. He had trained at a program with a name that opened doors throughout his career, and he had never quite stopped mentioning it, even 20 years later, in moments that didn't strictly require the reminder. He had married young, divorced in his early 40s after a marriage that had gradually, quietly eroded under the specific pressure of a career that consumed considerably more of his attention than his family life, and had thrown himself, in the years since, even more fully into his professional identity, a specific, if unexamined, substitution of career achievement for the personal connection he had lost, one that had only deepened his reliance on being recognized, consistently and visibly, as the most capable person in any given room. He had noticed Charlotte during her first month at Brennan Memorial, mostly because she had, with quiet but unmistakable confidence, flagged an inconsistency in his post-operative orders for a patient with complex vascular injuries. It had been the correct call. It had also, in Whitfield's private calculus, marked her as a nurse who didn't fully understand the appropriate boundaries of her role, and he had carried a low-grade, persistent irritation toward her ever since, an irritation that had never risen to open conflict, but had shaded, consistently, every interaction between them with a specific coolness Charlotte had simply learned to work around. That morning began like any other, until 10:47, when a call came through that the trauma bay was about to receive a critical gunshot wound patient, no identification, brought in by a private vehicle rather than an ambulance, which typically signaled circumstances considerably more complicated than the routine gang violence or domestic incidents the ER more commonly absorbed. The patient was a man in his late 30s, unconscious, his blood pressure critically low, a gunshot wound to the lower abdomen that had clearly been sustained hours earlier rather than minutes, judging by the extent of blood loss and the degree of shock he'd already progressed into by the time he arrived. He carried no identification, having apparently discarded it deliberately at some point after the injury, a detail that would only make sense to the trauma team hours later, once the full context of his presence became clear. Whitfield took the case personally, as Brennan Memorial's senior trauma surgeon typically did for the most severe presentations, and Charlotte was assigned as circulating nurse in the trauma bay. A routine rotation, nothing deliberate about the pairing, simply the ordinary churn of a hospital's staffing schedule. The wound assessment took a wrong turn almost immediately. BP's dropping faster than the visible wound explains, Charlotte said, 20 seconds into the assessment, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable urgency underneath it. Given the trajectory and the entry angle, I'd want to rule out a secondary injury to the femoral vessels before we commit to the abdominal repair as the primary priority. I've assessed the wound, Whitfield said, not looking up, his voice carrying the particular edge he reserved specifically for Charlotte, a tone none of the other nurses in that bay ever seemed to receive from him. The abdominal injury is the clear priority. I don't need a secondary opinion from circulating staff. I understand, Charlotte said. I'm not offering a secondary opinion on the surgical approach. I'm flagging a vitals pattern that doesn't fully match a purely abdominal injury. The pressures crashing faster than the wound track alone would explain. Step aside, Whitfield said, his voice sharper now, carrying the specific, dismissive impatience of a man unaccustomed to interruption during a critical assessment. This isn't a situation that requires a nurse's opinion. I need the room focused, not second-guessed. The trauma bay went quiet, the specific uncomfortable stillness of colleagues watching a public correction unfold in real time. Charlotte absorbed the dismissal with the same flat, controlled composure she brought to everything, stepping back from the immediate bedside without argument, though her attention remained locked on the patient's vitals, tracking the specific, worsening trend that Whitfield's focused abdominal assessment was, in her professional judgment, not going to catch in time. "Understood, doctor," she said, and it was in the exact moment she finished saying it that the unconscious patient's eyes fluttered open, a brief, disoriented flicker of returning consciousness that the trauma team recognized as a critical, narrow window, the kind of moment where a patient in his condition might manage a handful of essential words before shock pulled him back under. His eyes moved past Whitfield, past the residents and techs surrounding the table, scanning the room with a specific, disciplined focus that seemed, briefly, entirely at odds with his critical condition, and landed, finally, on Charlotte, standing several feet back exactly where Whitfield had ordered her to stand. Something in his face changed. Recognition, slow and disbelieving, moving through the fog of blood loss and shock. "I need Lieutenant Hale," he said, his voice a rough, barely audible rasp. "Get her back here, now." The trauma bay went completely silent. Charlotte moved before anyone else in the room had fully processed what had just been said, closing the distance to the bedside with a fast, controlled economy of motion that felt, to everyone watching, like an entirely different woman than the one who had stepped back so quietly moments earlier. "I'm here," she said, leaning over the patient, her voice dropping into a low, steady register that carried none of the careful deference she'd shown Whitfield seconds before. "Petty Officer Reyes, I need you to stay with me. Can you tell me what happened?" "Convoy," Reyes managed, his words slurring with the effort of staying conscious. "Ambush, femoral. I think the femorals." "I know," Charlotte said, already moving, her hands returning to the assessment with a speed and precision that made Whitfield's earlier dismissal feel, in retrospect, like it belonged to an entirely different morning. "You're safe. I've got you." Whitfield stood frozen at the head of the table, staring at the exchange with an expression of dawning, disbelieving confusion. "Lieutenant," he repeated, testing the word as though it might resolve into something that made more sense than what he'd just heard. "What does he mean, Lieutenant?" Charlotte didn't answer him immediately. She was focused entirely on Reyes now, her hands moving with fast, precise efficiency as she reassessed the wound, calling out findings in the same clipped, authoritative register she'd used moments earlier, the same register Whitfield had just publicly dismissed as unnecessary to the room. "There's a secondary injury to the femoral vessels," she said. "That's why the pressure's crashing faster than the abdominal wound alone explains. He needs vascular repair immediately, in addition to the abdominal work, doctor, or we're going to lose him to blood loss before the primary repair's even finished." "You can't possibly know that without imaging confirmation," Whitfield said, though the conviction in his voice had noticeably weakened. "I don't know it with absolute certainty," Charlotte said. "I know it from the vitals pattern and the trajectory, which is exactly what I told you 2 minutes ago, before you told me to step aside. You can order the imaging to confirm it, doctor, but every minute we spend confirming what the vitals are already telling us is a minute he doesn't have." Reyes, still fading in and out of full consciousness, managed a rough, pained breath that might have been a laugh under different circumstances. "She's right," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "She's always right. Ask anyone who served with her." Whitfield looked between Charlotte and the patient, and something in his expression, the specific, disorienting collapse of a man watching every assumption he'd built about a colleague crumble in real time, in front of his entire team, finally broke through his resistance. "Prep for vascular repair alongside the abdominal work," he said to the surgical team. "Now, full team, additional blood products on standby." The room moved. Charlotte stayed at Reyes's side through the frantic several minutes of stabilization, her hands steady, her voice low and reassuring, the specific bedside competence of someone who had done this exact work, keeping a critically wounded operator alive long enough to reach definitive surgical care, more times than she had ever fully counted. "How do you know him?" Whitfield asked, following alongside as the team prepared to move Reyes toward the OR, his earlier certainty entirely gone now, replaced by something that sounded, for the first time since Charlotte had started at Brennan Memorial, almost like genuine uncertainty about his own judgment. "We served together," Charlotte said, not elaborating further, her attention still fully on Reyes's vitals. "That's a conversation for after he's stable, Doctor. Right now, I need you focused on keeping him alive." Whitfield, for the first time in 2 years, did not argue with her. Reyes went into surgery at 11:14 a.m., 27 minutes after arrival, with a surgical team reorganized to address both the abdominal wound and the femoral injury Charlotte had identified, a combination that would almost certainly have gone undiscovered until it was too late, had Whitfield's original assessment gone unchallenged. The surgery lasted just over 4 hours. Charlotte waited outside the OR for the entire duration, declining offers to take a break, sitting in the surgical waiting area with the same controlled stillness she brought to everything, her mind running back through 2 years of carefully constructed distance from exactly this kind of moment. The specific, suspended dread of waiting to learn whether someone she'd once been responsible for keeping alive was going to survive without her. Whitfield found her there an hour into the wait, having finished his shift's other responsibilities, and sat down in the chair beside her without asking permission, an unusual gesture from a man who had spent 2 years maintaining a careful, critical distance from her at every opportunity. "I owe you an explanation for my behavior this morning," he said. "Or an apology. Possibly both, though I'm still working out which comes first." "You don't owe me anything right now," Charlotte said, not looking away from the closed OR doors. "I'd rather focus on him." "I understand," Whitfield said. "I'll wait until you're ready." He was quiet for a moment, and then, despite himself, curiosity won out over patience. "Lieutenant," he said carefully, "that's a Navy rank." "It is," Charlotte said. "You were a Navy officer." "I was. And the patient, Reyes, he asked for you by name and rank, like it was something he'd used 100 times before, like you'd actually served together, not just—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Not just some connection I'm not understanding correctly." Charlotte finally turned to look at him, and something in her expression, for the first time since he'd known her, held none of the careful, deferential distance she usually maintained around him. "I held the rank of lieutenant for 4 years, she said. "I was a trauma medicine liaison embedded with a Navy SEAL platoon. I delivered frontline medical care in combat conditions considerably worse than anything you've encountered in 20 years of civilian trauma surgery, Doctor, and I've kept operators alive in circumstances that would have overwhelmed most trauma teams' confidence within the first several minutes." She paused, letting that land. "I didn't tell you any of this because it wasn't relevant to doing my job here, and because I've spent 2 years trying to build a life where I don't have to keep proving myself to people who've already decided, before they've actually watched me work, that I don't know what I'm doing." Whitfield absorbed this in silence for a long moment, the specific, visible process of a man recalculating an enormous amount of accumulated certainty in real time. "I told you to step aside," he said finally, "while you were correctly identifying an injury I hadn't caught." "You did," Charlotte said. "I don't have a version of that moment that makes me look like anything other than exactly what you probably think I am." "I don't think anything about you yet," Charlotte said. "I think you made a serious mistake this morning, in front of an entire trauma team, one that could have cost a man his life if he hadn't happened to regain consciousness at exactly the right moment to say something you couldn't ignore. What I think about you long-term depends entirely on what you do next. That's true of most people, in my experience." The moment they get it wrong matters less than what they do in the aftermath. Whitfield nodded slowly, and the two of them sat together in the surgical waiting area in a silence that had shifted, subtly, from adversarial into something more uncertain, both of them waiting for the same set of doors to open with news that would determine considerably more than just one patient's outcome. The surgeon emerged at 3:22 that afternoon, exhausted but carrying the specific, controlled relief of someone delivering good news after a genuinely difficult case. "He made it," she said, addressing Charlotte directly, having been informed by the OR staff of the specific connection between the nurse and the patient. "The vascular repair was extensive, but we got to it in time. Whoever caught that femoral involvement before imaging confirmed it saved his life as much as anything we did in that OR." Charlotte closed her eyes briefly, the specific, private release of relief she rarely allowed herself to show in front of colleagues. "Thank you," she said. "When can I see him?" "He'll be in recovery for a few hours, then move to the ICU." It was 4:40 that afternoon, while Charlotte was checking on Reyes's stabilized vitals in the ICU, that a Navy commander walked through Brennan Memorial's main entrance and asked the front desk for directions to Reyes's room, using a specificity that immediately, instinctively signaled to hospital security that this was not an ordinary visitor. Commander Elizabeth Cray was 41 years old, compact and precise in every movement, with the specific bearing of someone who had spent 2 decades being the most competent person in nearly every room she entered, and had long since stopped needing to prove it. She had commanded the SEAL platoon Reyes belonged to for the final 2 years of Charlotte's service, and she had flown in the moment word reached her that one of her operators had been wounded during what was, officially, an off-the-books reconnaissance assignment that was not supposed to have put him anywhere near American soil, let alone in an emergency room with a gunshot wound. Cray had worked directly alongside Charlotte during those final 2 years, and had, in that time, developed a particular professional respect for her that extended well beyond the ordinary chain-of-command relationship. A respect built on repeated, direct observation of her performance under exactly the kind of extreme conditions that separated genuinely exceptional medical liaisons from merely competent ones. She had approved Charlotte's separation request with real reluctance, understanding even then the specific caliber of expertise the Navy was losing, but had also recognized, watching her carefully through the final months of her service, that Charlotte had reached a point where continuing to shoulder that particular weight was no longer sustainable, whatever the institutional cost of losing her. She reached the ICU wing within minutes, moving with the fast, controlled urgency of someone who understood exactly how much operational sensitivity was currently exposed by Reyes's presence in a civilian hospital, and found Charlotte standing at his bedside, checking his monitors with the same steady, unhurried focus she'd shown all day. Cray stopped in the doorway, and something in her face shifted from professional urgency into genuine, startled recognition. "Hail," she said. Charlotte turned, and for one full second, something passed across her face that she had not allowed anyone at Brennan Memorial to see in 2 years. Genuine shock, the specific expression of someone encountering a piece of their past they had believed, or at least hoped, might never find them again. "Commander," Charlotte said, and her voice, usually so controlled, carried a specific rawness that hadn't been there a moment earlier. Cray crossed the room toward her, ignoring the hospital staff who had gathered at a cautious distance, ignoring Whitfield, who had followed her in and stopped dead near the door at the sight of a Navy officer addressing his nurse with a familiarity that made absolutely no sense given everything he believed he understood about the hospital's hierarchy. "You're the one who caught the femoral injury," Cray said. "I got the preliminary report on the flight in. Nobody else in that room caught it, just you." "I caught it," Charlotte confirmed. "The attending surgeon initially assessed it as purely abdominal." Cray looked past Charlotte toward Whitfield, standing near the door with an expression of visible discomfort, and something in her gaze carried an unmistakable, cold assessment. "Doctor," she said, "I need to speak with Lieutenant Hale privately about the specifics of this patient's medical needs going forward. I'd appreciate your cooperation in giving us that space." Whitfield, uncertain how to categorize the authority currently addressing him, simply nodded and stepped back, and Cray waited until he'd cleared the room before turning back to Charlotte, her expression softening slightly. "I need your help," Cray said. "Not just with Reyes's immediate care, though I'd like your continued involvement in that if you're willing. I need your help with something considerably larger, and I want to be direct about the fact that I'm asking only for you. Not for a hospital committee's approval, not for whatever formal channels this civilian institution would normally require. I flew in specifically to find you, once I confirmed you were the nurse who'd caught what nobody else in that trauma bay caught." "What do you need?" Charlotte asked. "Reyes wasn't supposed to be on American soil," Cray said, her voice dropping lower, carrying the particular weight of information she was choosing to share carefully. "He was compromised during a reconnaissance operation that's still active, still classified, and still ongoing with 3 other operators currently in the field. I need someone with your specific medical and operational background to help me assess whether his injuries and his presence here have compromised that operation's security. And I need it from someone I can trust completely, not from an outside consultant I'd need to fully brief from scratch." She paused. "I know you separated from active duty for reasons I respect and won't ask you to fully revisit today. But I'm asking you directly, Charlotte, not as your former commanding officer giving an order, but as someone who trusts your judgment more than almost anyone else's I've worked with in 15 years of service. Will you help me?" Charlotte considered the question with the same careful honesty she brought to everything, weighing 2 years of carefully constructed civilian peace against the specific, familiar pull of a request she understood. Immediately, she was not going to refuse. "I'll help," she said, "on the condition that it doesn't require me to fully return to that world. I can consult, I can assess, I can use what I know. I'm not interested in becoming Lieutenant Hale again, full-time, whatever this specific situation requires." "That's exactly the arrangement I was hoping for," Cray said, something like genuine relief moving through her voice. "I don't want to pull you back into active service, Charlotte. I want your judgment on this specific problem, from someone who understands both the operational stakes and the civilian medical environment we're currently operating inside of." They spent the following 2 hours in a borrowed hospital office, Cray walking Charlotte through the specific, carefully compartmentalized details of the operation Reyes had been compromised during. A reconnaissance mission targeting a weapons trafficking network with connections that extended uncomfortably into domestic territory, which explained both why Reyes had been wounded on American soil and why his continued presence in a civilian hospital carried genuine security risk if the wrong people connected the dots between his injury and the operation's broader scope. "The immediate concern," Cray explained, "is whether anyone treating him here has inadvertently documented details that could compromise the other 3 operators still in the field. I need someone who understands both medical documentation protocols and operational security to review everything that's been recorded since he arrived, and to help me determine what needs to be handled through more discreet channels going forward." Charlotte worked through Reyes's chart methodically, the same careful, precise attention she brought to every clinical review, cross-referencing each entry against the specific classification protocols she remembered from her own years of embedded service, protocols that most civilian medical documentation systems had never been designed to accommodate. She identified 2 specific documentation entries that, while medically appropriate, contained details that could, in the wrong hands, provide meaningful intelligence about the broader operation's scope and timeline. "These need to be handled differently," she told Cray, flagging the entries. Not falsified, I won't compromise the medical record's integrity for operational convenience. But there are legitimate classification protocols for exactly this kind of situation, and I don't think this hospital's standard documentation system was built with those protocols in mind. Can you help me implement them properly? Cray asked. I can, Charlotte said, but I'll need Dr. Whitfield's cooperation, given his role as attending physician. That's going to require explaining considerably more to him than either of us might prefer. Cray considered this, weighing the specific, complicated calculus of operational security against practical necessity. Bring him in, she said finally, carefully, with appropriate limits on what he's told. But if his cooperation's genuinely necessary, I'd rather manage that directly than leave a gap in the security protocol. Whitfield joined them 20 minutes later, uncertain and visibly still processing the morning's cascading revelations, and Cray briefed him with careful precision. Enough detail to secure his genuine cooperation, nothing beyond what his role actually required him to know. I need your assurance, Cray told him, that going forward, any documentation related to this patient follows the modified protocol Lieutenant Hale is about to walk you through, and that any questions from outside this room about his specific injuries or the circumstances of his arrival get directed to hospital administration rather than answered directly by clinical staff. I understand, Whitfield said, and something in his voice carried none of his earlier defensive certainty, replaced instead by the specific, sobered attentiveness of a man who had spent the entire day discovering exactly how much he didn't understand about a colleague he'd spent 2 years underestimating. I'll make sure the team follows the protocol exactly as specified. Thank you, Cray said, and then, turning to Charlotte with something warmer in her expression, I meant what I said earlier. I asked specifically for you, not for whatever institutional process this hospital would normally require. That trust isn't something I extend easily, Charlotte. I want you to understand how much I meant it. I understand, Charlotte said, and I appreciate it, more than I probably let on. Whitfield, standing several feet away, absorbed the exchange with the particular, disorienting weight of a man watching, in real time, the full scope of exactly who his colleague actually was. Considerably larger, considerably more consequential than the careful, contained version of her he'd spent 2 years choosing to see. What none of them yet understood was that the weapons trafficking network Reyes had been compromised while investigating had, within hours of his hospital admission, begun its own quiet effort to determine exactly what had happened to their operation and how much exposure they were currently facing. A mid-level coordinator within the network, a man named Dmitry Volkov, had tracked Reyes's movements closely enough to know he'd been wounded and to suspect, correctly, that he'd been taken to the nearest major trauma center. And Volkov, understanding the specific catastrophic risk Reyes's survival and eventual testimony posed to the entire network, had begun assembling a plan to ensure that risk never fully materialized. Volkov arrived at Brennan Memorial that evening, using a maintenance contractor's credentials obtained through a corrupted vendor relationship the network had cultivated over several years, specifically for situations requiring exactly this kind of institutional access. He carried a suppressed pistol and a plan narrowed, by hours of mounting urgency, into something brutally direct. Locate Reyes's room, eliminate the threat he posed, and disappear before hospital security fully processed what had happened. Volkov had not always occupied the specific, desperate position he now found himself in. He had spent his first decade of adult life as a legitimate logistics coordinator for an international shipping firm, competent and unremarkable, before a series of personal financial crises had made him vulnerable to recruitment by a network that specialized in identifying exactly this kind of quiet, professionally credible desperation. He had told himself in the early years that his role was purely administrative, insulated from the actual violence the network's broader operations sometimes required. That insulation had eroded gradually, the way it usually did, until the morning he found himself planning to personally eliminate a wounded federal operative in a civilian hospital, a version of himself he would have found genuinely unrecognizable a decade earlier. He had not accounted for the fact that Commander Cray, understanding precisely how exposed Reyes's position had become the moment his hospitalization connected to an active operation, had quietly arranged for a two-person federal security detail to be stationed outside his ICU room. Nor had he accounted for Charlotte, who had spent the intervening hours reviewing security protocols with a specific, trained vigilance that 2 years of civilian life had done nothing to erase. Charlotte had, in fact, spent part of that evening walking the ICU corridor herself, unofficially, checking sightlines and access points with the same methodical thoroughness she'd once brought to securing a forward position, an instinct she hadn't consciously decided to act on so much as simply found herself following, the specific, automatic vigilance of someone whose training had never truly gone dormant, merely quiet. She noticed Volkov in the ICU corridor at 8:15 that evening, a man in a maintenance uniform moving with a controlled, deliberate gait that had nothing to do with routine facility work, his eyes tracking room numbers with a focus that immediately, instinctively registered as wrong. She did not hesitate. Maintenance worker, moving toward the ICU with a target lock, not browsing, she said quietly to the nearest security officer, her voice low and urgent. That's not routine. I need eyes on him now. The officer turned, and in the half-second it took him to process her warning, Volkov understood, with the specific sinking certainty of a plan already unraveling, that he'd been noticed. He didn't hesitate either. He drew the suppressed pistol and fired at the nearest security officer before either officer had fully processed the threat, and the quiet ICU corridor that had been ordinary a heartbeat earlier erupted into chaos. The wounded officer went down, hit in the shoulder, and his partner scrambled for cover, drawing his own weapon but hampered by the confined space and the panicked movement of visiting family members diving for cover around them. Volkov, seeing his direct route to Reyes's room now blocked by chaos he hadn't anticipated, made a fast, desperate calculation and turned toward Charlotte instead, understanding, in the specific brutal logic of a cornered operative, that eliminating the person who'd exposed him might be the only outcome from this operation he could still salvage. Charlotte moved before he'd fully raised the weapon. She had spent 4 years training for exactly this kind of close-quarters threat assessment, and the specific muscle memory of it asserted itself without any conscious deliberation on her part. She dropped low and to the side as Volkov fired, the round punching into the wall behind where she'd been standing a half-second earlier, and closed the remaining distance between them before he could adjust his aim for a second shot. The confrontation that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Brutal and economical, Charlotte's training asserting itself with the same fast, controlled violence she'd once used against threats, considerably better armed and better trained than a desperate network coordinator operating well outside any combat experience he actually possessed. She redirected the weapon's barrel with one hand, drove her other forearm into his throat with enough controlled force to disrupt his balance without causing permanent damage, and had him disarmed and on the ground, her knee against his shoulder blade, before the second security officer had even cleared his own cover. "Stay down," she said, her voice flat and absolute, the same register she'd used a lifetime ago in circumstances considerably more dangerous than a hospital corridor. "Don't move, and don't make me regret being careful with you." Volkov, pinned and breathing hard, said nothing, which was, in its own way, confirmation enough of exactly who he was. The security guard, recovering his composure, moved in to help secure Volkov properly, and within minutes, the hospital that had spent the entire day slowly absorbing the extraordinary truth about one of its nurses was absorbing a second, considerably more visceral demonstration of exactly what that truth actually meant in practice. Commander Cray arrived at the scene within minutes, Having heard the commotion from a nearby conference room where she'd been coordinating with federal liaisons about Reyes's security arrangements, and found Charlotte exactly where she'd left her earlier that day, steady, composed, entirely unshaken by having just disarmed an armed intruder in the middle of a hospital corridor. "Are you hurt?" Cray asked, scanning her for injury. "No," Charlotte said. "The security officer took a shoulder wound. He'll need surgery, but he'll be fine." She looked down at Volkov, still restrained beneath her, and something in her expression carried the specific, complicated weight of the day finally, fully resolving. "This is who's been trying to determine Reyes's location. He came here to eliminate the threat before it could compromise the rest of the operation." Cray looked down at Volkov with an expression that had gone entirely cold. "You just stopped a considerably larger security failure than either of us anticipated when I walked into this building this afternoon," she said. "I don't think I have anything close to an adequate response to that." "You don't need one," Charlotte said quietly. "I didn't do it for a response. I did it because he was about to hurt someone, and I was positioned to stop it. That's the whole of it, most days." Marcus Whitfield arrived at the scene 4 minutes later, having heard the commotion from a nearby exam room, and found Charlotte being helped to her feet by Commander Cray, federal agents taking custody of a man in a maintenance uniform, a wounded security officer being loaded onto a gurney, with the specific urgency of someone who needed surgery immediately. He stood at the edge of the scene for a long moment, processing, the events of the entire day compressing into something he was only now beginning to fully absorb: the trauma bay that morning, the classified briefing that afternoon, and now this, a second act of violence in the same building on the same day, resolved before it could claim a single additional life because the nurse he had spent 2 years dismissing had, once again, been faster and more capable than everyone else in the building combined. He did not try to insert himself into the scene. He simply stood and watched and waited until the immediate chaos had settled into the more orderly aftermath of federal processing before approaching Charlotte, who was sitting on a gurney in the hallway while a paramedic checked her over as a formality, her hands finally beginning, in the safety of the aftermath, to show the faint tremor of adrenaline finally catching up with her. "I need to operate on the officer your intruder shot," Whitfield said. "I wanted you to know before I went in. Whatever's happened today, whatever I've gotten wrong, I'm not going to get this wrong. I'm going to save him." "I know you are," Charlotte said. "You're a genuinely gifted surgeon, Doctor." That was never actually the problem. Then what was? Whitfield asked. And for the first time all day, the question came without any defensiveness underneath it. Genuine, and searching in a way Charlotte hadn't heard from him before. She considered the question honestly, the way she considered everything. "You've spent 20 years being the most skilled person in every room you walk into," she said. "And somewhere along the way, that turned into believing you had to be the only competent person in the room, instead of understanding that other people's competence doesn't actually diminish yours. I've watched you dismiss good information all day, not because it was wrong, but because it didn't come from you. That's not a skill problem, Doctor. That's a listening problem. And it's going to keep costing you patience, and staff, and eventually your own reputation, until you actually fix it." Whitfield absorbed that in silence for a long moment. "That's a hard thing to hear," he said finally. "It's a harder thing to say to someone who told me to step aside this morning while I was correctly identifying an injury that could have killed a patient," Charlotte said, though there was, for the first time, something almost gentle underneath the words. "I'm not trying to punish you, Doctor. I'm telling you because I think you're actually capable of hearing it, if you're willing to. That's more than I'd say about most people who've talked to me the way you have." "I want to be capable of hearing it," Whitfield said. "I don't know yet if that's the same thing as actually being capable, but I want to find out." "That's a start," Charlotte said. "Go save your patient. We can finish this conversation another time." The meeting Brennan Memorial's administration assembled the following morning filled a conference room well beyond its intended capacity. Department heads, hospital legal counsel, federal liaisons coordinating with Commander Cray's team, and, seated near the front rather than his earlier position of unquestioned authority, Marcus Whitfield, his posture carrying the specific alertness of a man who understood exactly what was about to be discussed. Charlotte stood at the front beside Commander Cray, still processing the accumulated weight of the previous day's events, and when the hospital's CEO, a measured woman named Dr. Patricia Renfield, opened the meeting, she deferred almost immediately to Cray, understanding correctly where the actual authority in the room currently resided. "Yesterday," Cray began, without notes in the flat, carrying voice of an officer accustomed to briefings that mattered. A wounded federal operative was brought into this hospital following a compromised reconnaissance operation. He is alive right now because a member of your nursing staff recognized a medical crisis your attending surgeon missed and acted on it despite being explicitly told to step aside. She let that settle before continuing. That nurse's name is Charlotte Hale. For the last 2 years, she has worked in this hospital under her legal name, performing her job with the same quiet excellence she brought to 7 years of active Navy service, the last 4 as a trauma medicine liaison embedded directly with a Navy SEAL platoon, delivering frontline medical care in combat conditions that make yesterday's crisis look, by comparison, almost manageable. Several heads in the room turned toward Charlotte, absorbing this in the particular silence of people recalibrating everything they thought they understood about a colleague. Later that same evening, Cray continued, she identified and neutralized an armed intruder attempting to access this hospital's ICU with the intent to eliminate a federal witness, preventing what would very likely have become a considerably more severe security failure, with implications extending well beyond this hospital's walls. Dr. Renfield spoke first into the silence that followed. "Ms. Hale," she said, testing the weight of the moment carefully, "on behalf of this hospital, I want to say I don't fully know the right words for a moment like this." "You don't need special words," Charlotte said quietly. "I did my job today. The same job I've been doing here for 2 years. It just looked a little different this time." It was into that fragile quiet that Marcus Whitfield rose from his seat. "I'd like to say something," he said, "if that's all right." Dr. Renfield nodded, stepping back to give him the floor. "Yesterday morning," Whitfield said, "I told an entire trauma team that a colleague's clinical assessment wasn't needed, in the middle of a critical resuscitation, while she was in the process of correctly identifying an injury I hadn't caught yet. I did it because I'd built an entire professional identity around the belief that my own judgment, once formed, rarely benefited from outside input, and because Charlotte Hale's employment history didn't fit the story I'd already decided to tell myself about her capabilities." He paused, and something in his usually confident bearing had genuinely, visibly left him. "I've spent the last 24 hours trying to understand why my certainty was so immediate, so absolute in that moment," he continued. "And I think the honest answer is that I mistook my own discomfort with not fully understanding someone for evidence that they weren't capable. That's not a mistake I'm proud of. It's also not, I suspect, a mistake I'm the only person in this hospital guilty of making, which is part of why I think this conversation matters beyond just my own individual failure." He turned to look at Charlotte directly. "You've been correcting my clinical judgment since your first month here, and I dismissed nearly all of it as overstepping, when the actual evidence, every single time, showed you were right. I owe you a considerably more specific apology than I gave you in that waiting room yesterday. Not just for the words themselves, but for the pattern underneath them." "I appreciate you saying that," Charlotte said. "In front of everyone, this time, instead of privately." "I think you were owed that specifically," Whitfield said. "The insult was public. I think the correction needed to be too." Charlotte found Reyes awake and alert the following afternoon, connected to a network of monitors and IV lines, but stable enough to manage a genuine, if weak, smile when she walked into his ICU room. "Lieutenant," he said, softer this time, without the desperate urgency of the trauma bay. "I heard about the intruder. Cray filled me in on the whole thing. You just took down an armed threat in a hospital hallway less than a day after saving my life in the OR." "I had a busy day," Charlotte said, pulling a chair up beside his bed. "I heard you left the service," Reyes said. "Nobody would tell me why. Command's not exactly forthcoming about that kind of thing." Charlotte was quiet for a moment, weighing how much to say, the way she weighed most things. "I needed something quieter," she said finally. "Not because I stopped believing in the work, because I'd watched too many people I cared about walk into danger, and I needed a version of medicine where the stakes felt more survivable, day to day." "You saved my life the same way you saved half our platoons over 4 years, Reyes said. "Doesn't seem like you've slowed down much, quiet civilian life or not." "The uniform's different," Charlotte said. "The instincts apparently aren't." Reyes studied her for a long moment, his expression turning more serious. "That doctor," he said, "the one who was dismissing you when I came in. He know the whole story now?" "Most of it," Charlotte said. "Enough to understand he was wrong. I don't think he fully understands yet how wrong, or why it matters as much as it does. That'll take longer than one conversation." "You want me to talk to him?" Reyes asked, something protective entering his weakened voice. "Because I've got some things I could tell him about exactly what kind of officer he almost dismissed." Charlotte almost smiled, the first genuinely unguarded expression she'd allowed herself in the conversation. "Not yet," she said. "Let him figure some of it out himself first. I think he's actually capable of it, if I give him room to." "You always did give people more chances than they deserved," Reyes said. "Not more than they deserved," Charlotte said. "Just more than they expected. There's a difference." That evening, alone in her apartment for the first time in what felt like considerably longer than 2 days, Charlotte allowed herself to think properly about the mission that had, 2 years earlier, finally convinced her she needed to leave active duty. It had not been a single catastrophic failure. It had been the accumulated weight of 4 years spent embedded with a platoon whose members she had grown to genuinely care about, men whose families she'd met, whose small, private fears she'd learned during long stretches of downtime between operations, whose survival had become, over those years, considerably more personal to her than the professional distance her role technically required. The specific loss that had broken something in her had involved an operator named Diego Salazar, 26 years old, engaged to be married, whom she had kept alive for nearly 9 hours after a compound assault went catastrophically wrong, only to lose him to complications that no amount of skill or determination on her part could have fully prevented. She had attended his funeral. She had sat with his fiancée in the immediate aftermath, offering what comfort she could while privately carrying a grief that felt both entirely hers and entirely inadequate to the scale of what had actually been lost. She had requested separation from active duty 4 months after that funeral, understanding, with a clarity that had taken considerable time to fully arrive at, that she needed to do the work somewhere the stakes didn't carry quite the same catastrophic finality, somewhere a mistake, however serious, was less likely to end in a folded flag and a young woman who would spend the rest of her life without the person she'd planned to marry. Civilian nursing had given her that. It had also, over 2 years, given her something else she hadn't fully anticipated: the specific, uncomplicated satisfaction of ordinary patient care, unburdened by the particular weight of operational stakes and personal attachment that had defined her military service. She had not expected that quieter version of the work to ever collide, quite this directly, with the version of herself she'd left behind. Reyes's arrival had changed that, had pulled the careful, deliberate distance she'd built between her 2 lives into sudden, disorienting alignment. and she found, sitting alone in her apartment that evening, that she was surprised by how much relief moved through her at finally not having to maintain the separation quite so carefully anymore. The federal investigation into Volkov's network moved quickly over the following weeks, driven by the specific urgency that attached itself to any case involving a compromised domestic operation with connections to international weapons trafficking. Volkov, facing decades in federal prison, made the calculation that most operational coordinators eventually made when confronted with overwhelming evidence. He began, carefully and incrementally, to cooperate, providing information that connected not just to the immediate attack on the hospital, but to a broader network that federal investigators had been trying to fully map for years. The investigation ultimately revealed connections extending across 3 states, implicating a considerably larger web of participants than the initial arrest had suggested, and federal prosecutors would later credit Volkov's cooperation, secured in no small part by the strength of Charlotte's own testimony and the physical evidence from the hospital confrontation, as instrumental in dismantling a trafficking operation that had, until that point, largely evaded sustained law enforcement attention. Charlotte gave a formal statement to federal investigators twice over the following month, describing both her clinical assessment of Reyes's injuries and her direct confrontation with Volkov, with the same flat, precise clarity she brought to everything, refusing to perform emotion for an audience even in moments that would have justified considerable emotional display, because the facts themselves carried more than enough weight without embellishment. Reyes, recovering steadily over the following weeks, provided his own testimony regarding the reconnaissance operation's broader context and the combined weight of both accounts, along with Volkov's own cooperation, ultimately contributed to a prosecution that would, over the following year, result in the dismantling of a significant portion of the weapons trafficking network's domestic operations. Commander Cray remained in periodic contact with Charlotte throughout this process, the professional relationship between them gradually evolving into something that carried genuine warmth alongside its operational necessity. "I want you to know," Cray told her, during one such conversation roughly 6 weeks after the initial crisis, "that what you did, both the clinical catch and the intervention with Volkov, is going to be part of the formal record now, whether either of us particularly wanted that visibility or not. I know you value your privacy. I wanted you to hear that directly from me before it became official." "I understand," Charlotte said. "I made my peace with that somewhere around the moment I disarmed a man in a hospital corridor in front of federal security cameras. I don't think staying quiet was ever really an option after that." "No," Cray agreed. "Probably not. But I want you to know that whatever recognition comes from this, I intend to make sure it properly credits what you actually did, rather than some sanitized version that undersells it for the sake of institutional tidiness." "I appreciate that," Charlotte said. "Though I'd ask, if it's within your control, that whatever recognition happens includes some acknowledgement of Diego Salazar, not as an afterthought, as part of the actual record of what this work costs and what it's worth." "I'll make sure of it," Cray said. "You have my word." 6 weeks after the intruder's attack, Commander Cray returned to Brennan Memorial, this time with advance notice and a formal delegation, for a ceremony Charlotte had initially resisted and eventually, at Cray's gentle but persistent urging, agreed to attend on her own carefully negotiated terms. Small, limited to those directly involved, and structured specifically to include acknowledgement of the operators she'd lost during her active service. The ceremony took place in Brennan Memorial's largest conference room, reconfigured for the occasion, filled with department heads and nursing staff who had worked alongside Charlotte for 2 years without ever suspecting the full shape of who she actually was. Marcus Whitfield sat in the front row, having spent the intervening 6 weeks in the slow, consistent work of demonstrating, through the accumulated small choices of an ordinary working schedule, that his apology had been the beginning of something genuine rather than simply a moment of public contrition. Reyes attended in a wheelchair, still recovering, but well enough to travel, present specifically because he had told Cray he wanted to see the thing through properly. The room had been decorated simply but thoughtfully, hospital administration having taken care to strike a tone that honored the gravity of the occasion without tipping into the kind of performative spectacle Charlotte would almost certainly have found uncomfortable. Modest floral arrangements, a small reception table set up along one wall, the specific understated dignity that Dr. Renfield's office had worked to ensure matched Charlotte's own preferences as closely as an institutional ceremony reasonably could. Diego Salazar's fiancée, a young woman named Priya Anand, who Charlotte had reached out to weeks earlier at Cray's specific insistence, sat near the front, having agreed to attend once she understood the ceremony would formally acknowledge the loss alongside the recognition. Commander Cray stood at the front of the room in formal dress uniform, and she spoke for nearly 15 minutes. First about the mission 2 years earlier, naming Salazar in full, describing without excessive operational detail the courage of the platoon Charlotte had served alongside, and the extraordinary sustained care she had provided across 4 years of embedded deployment. Petty Officer Salazar's fiancée is here today, at Lieutenant Hale's specific request, Cray said, gesturing toward Priya, because Lieutenant Hale understood, better than most, that today's recognition means nothing if it doesn't also honor what this work has genuinely cost, and who it's cost it to. A quiet, respectful stillness moved through the room, the specific weight of grief being allowed, for a moment, to sit alongside recognition rather than being crowded out by it. Then Cray turned to the matter of Charlotte Hale. 2 years ago, she said, this woman spent 4 years delivering frontline medical care to a SEAL platoon under conditions that tested every ounce of her skill and composure, repeatedly, without ever once failing to show up fully for the people depending on her. 6 weeks ago, in this hospital, she did something similar, correctly diagnosing a critical injury over the explicit objection of an attending physician who told her to step aside, and then, hours later, disarming an armed intruder who came to this building specifically to eliminate the patient whose life she had just saved. She paused, looking directly at Charlotte. Lieutenant Charlotte Hale's full service record, previously understated in every civilian context she's operated in since her separation, has been formally reviewed and, effective this week, recognized for purposes of proper accounting. I am authorized to inform this room that Lieutenant Hale is being awarded the Navy Commendation Medal for her actions defending Brennan Memorial Hospital, in addition to formal recognition, long overdue, of her sustained service alongside a platoon that owes her more than any single ceremony can adequately capture. The room absorbed this in the particular silence of people confronting the true scale of a colleague's history for the first time. Lieutenant Hale, Cray said, please stand. Charlotte stood. She stood the way she did everything. Without performance, without visible ceremony of her own, her golden blonde hair catching the overhead light, her spine straight, her hands loosely at her sides, the same composed stillness she'd carried through 2 years of quiet civilian shifts and one extraordinary series of events that had, by the end of it, revealed the entire shape of who she actually was. Cray crossed the room to her, and the citation she read aloud described, in the careful, formal language of military commendation, actions that everyone in that room had either witnessed directly or heard, recounted so many times over the preceding weeks that the words carried the specific weight of institutional memory, finally catching up to lived experience. When Cray finished, she pinned the medal to Charlotte's uniform, a formal Navy service uniform delivered quietly 2 days earlier, the first time she'd worn one in over 2 years, and stepped back, and for a moment neither of them said anything, the specific silence of two people who understood exactly how much distance had been covered between an ordinary Tuesday morning and this room, this moment, this long overdue accounting finally spoken aloud instead of carried privately. On behalf of the United States Navy, Cray said, her voice carrying the particular formal weight of an official record being spoken into existence. And on behalf of Petty Officer Diego Salazar, whose service and sacrifice deserve to be remembered alongside every life his medic went on to save afterward. Thank you, Lieutenant. We see you. We have always owed you this. Whitfield was the first to start clapping, alone for one full second before the rest of the room joined him, the applause building through the space with the specific, cumulative warmth of an entire institution recalibrating all at once its understanding of someone it had genuinely, thoroughly underestimated. Charlotte did not cry, not fully, though something in her composure, watching the room stand, Whitfield on his feet immediately, Reyes pushing himself upright in his wheelchair despite his continued recovery, Priya Anand wiping tears from her own eyes near the front. Something in her expression softened, finally, into an emotion she rarely allowed herself in front of an audience, something that looked, unmistakably, like relief mixed with grief mixed with a specific, hard-won peace. After the ceremony, in the quieter aftermath of a reception the hospital had organized, Marcus Whitfield found her near the window, a cup of coffee in her hand, watching the parking lot below with the same unhurried stillness she brought to everything. "I wanted to say something," he said, "that I don't think I managed to say properly 6 weeks ago." "You don't have to keep apologizing," Charlotte said, not unkindly. "I told you back then. It's about what you do next, not about saying it enough times." "This isn't only an apology," Whitfield said. "I wanted to say that watching you work, over these 6 weeks, differently than I ever let myself watch you before, has been the most instructive thing that's happened to me in 20 years of practice. Not the ceremony today, the actual work, the way you talk to patients, the way you've been quietly mentoring some of the newer residents without ever making them feel small for not already knowing something. I built an entire career on the assumption that competence needed to announce itself loudly to be real. You've spent 2 years proving that assumption wrong in ways I'm going to be unlearning for a long time." Charlotte considered him for a moment. This man who had told her to step aside and then, 6 weeks later, stood in front of an entire hospital and admitted, without prompting, exactly how wrong he'd been. "I appreciate that," she said. "I mean it. And for what it's worth, I've noticed the difference, not just today, in the small things, over these 6 weeks. That matters more than the speech." "Good," Whitfield said, something like genuine relief moving through his expression. "That was the part I was actually hoping you'd notice. Are you staying at Brennan Memorial?" he asked. "Now that everything's different." Charlotte looked out the window again, at the parking lot, at the ordinary afternoon light falling across ordinary cars belonging to ordinary people, going about their ordinary days, unaware of the extraordinary things that had happened inside the building beside them. "I'm staying," she said. "This is the work I actually want to be doing. The medal doesn't change that. If anything, it just means I get to do it without carrying the weight of hiding half of who I am while I'm doing it." "Good," Whitfield said. "This hospital's better with you in it. I should have understood that 2 years ago. I understand it now." Later that evening, once most of the reception had cleared, Charlotte found Priya Anand sitting alone at a small table near the window, turning an untouched cup of coffee slowly between her hands. "Thank you for coming," Charlotte said, sitting down across from her. "I know it wasn't an easy thing to say yes to." "I almost didn't," Priya admitted. "Every time I get pulled back into anything connected to that mission, it takes me weeks to feel steady again afterward. But Commander Cray said you specifically asked for me to be here, and I couldn't quite bring myself to say no to that, given everything I know you did for him out there." "I didn't do enough," Charlotte said quietly. "That's the part I've never fully made peace with, even 2 years later." Priya reached across the table and took Charlotte's hand. An unexpected, generous gesture from a woman who had every reason to hold considerably more complicated feelings toward the medic, who hadn't been able to save the man she'd loved. I read the after-action report, she said. The real one, not the sanitized version they gave families initially. I know exactly what you did out there, and exactly what the mission actually threw at you. There wasn't a version where you saved everyone, Charlotte. I've made my peace with that, as much as anyone ever fully makes peace with something like this. What I haven't ever gotten the chance to say properly is thank you for staying with him at the end, so he wasn't alone. Charlotte felt something in her chest tighten, the specific ache of grief that never fully resolved but occasionally, in moments like this one, found somewhere safe to rest for a while. He talked about you constantly, she said. Every deployment. He had this way of describing your laugh that made the rest of us feel like we already knew you before we ever actually met you. Priya's eyes filled with tears, and this time she let them fall without trying to hide it. Tell me, she said. Tell me everything you remember. I know some of it already, from the reports, but I want to hear it from someone who was actually there, who actually knew him the way I did. They talked for nearly an hour, Charlotte sharing memories she'd carried privately for 2 years, small, specific details that had never made it into any official report. The particular jokes Salazar made under pressure, the way he'd talked about the wedding they'd been planning, the ring he'd shown Charlotte 2 weeks before the mission, with the specific, nervous pride of a man who couldn't quite believe his own luck. By the time they finished, something in both of them had settled, not resolved, because grief like this never fully resolved, but settled in the particular way that comes from finally being able to share the weight instead of carrying it entirely alone. Priya mentioned, near the end of their conversation, that she had eventually gone back to school, completing a degree in social work, specifically motivated by her experience navigating grief support systems that had, in her assessment, often fallen short of what grieving military families actually needed. She had begun, in the 2 years since, working directly with other families navigating similar losses, a career path she credited, in part, to conversations not unlike the one she was currently having with Charlotte. I like to think some good came out of all of it, Priya said. Not that it makes the loss worth it. Nothing makes that worth it. But I'd rather build something meaningful out of the grief than just let it sit there, unused. I think that's exactly right, Charlotte said. I've tried to do something similar, in my own way, with the mentoring program at the hospital. It doesn't undo anything, but it makes the weight feel less like it's simply being wasted. Before Priya left, she pressed a small photograph into Charlotte's hand. Salazar, laughing at something off camera, the specific unguarded happiness of a man who hadn't yet known how little time he had left. I have a dozen copies, Priya said. I want you to have one. Not as a burden, just so you know I don't think about that mission and see only what it cost me. I see him too, the way he actually was, and I wanted you to have a piece of that instead of only carrying the ending. Charlotte kept the photograph in her wallet from that day forward, a small, private reminder tucked behind her hospital badge, carried quietly through every subsequent shift, as a piece of the story that belonged only to her and to the people who had genuinely known him. 6 months after the ceremony, Brennan Memorial's trauma floor had settled into a new, quieter version of its old rhythms. Charlotte still worked her regular shifts, still caught medication and diagnostic errors before they became problems, and had, over the preceding months, taken on an increasingly deliberate mentoring role with a second-year nurse named Sophia Renner, sharp and capable, but visibly uncertain of her own judgment in high-pressure situations. Sophia had come to nursing after an earlier, abandoned attempt at medical school, a decision she rarely discussed openly, but that had left her, Charlotte suspected, with a particular sensitivity to questions about her own competence, the specific, lingering uncertainty of someone who had once been told, implicitly or explicitly, that she wasn't quite good enough for one professional path, and who carried that uncertainty forward into her current one, even though the circumstances were, in reality, entirely different. I flagged something in a chart today and got shut down, Sophia told Charlotte one evening, during a rare quiet stretch on an otherwise slow shift, her voice carrying the particular defensive edge of someone bracing for a confrontation she wasn't sure how to navigate. "Not by Dr. Whitfield. He's actually been really receptive lately, which everyone says is new. It was one of the other attendings. He told me I was overstepping." Charlotte considered this with the same careful honesty she brought to everything. "Was your assessment correct?" she asked. "I think so," Sophia said. "I'm not entirely certain, which is part of why I didn't push back harder when he dismissed it. That uncertainty is worth examining honestly," Charlotte said. "Sometimes it's genuine uncertainty about the clinical question, which is worth taking seriously and seeking a second opinion on. But sometimes it's uncertainty about whether you're allowed to be right, which is a different problem entirely, and one I recognize because I spent considerable time managing exactly that uncertainty myself." "How do you tell the difference?" Sophia asked. "Practice," Charlotte said, "and a willingness to be wrong sometimes, publicly, without it destroying your confidence entirely. I've been wrong before, Sophia. Not about the incident that got me a medal, but plenty of other times, in smaller, quieter ways. Being wrong occasionally doesn't disqualify you from trusting your judgment generally. It's just information about where to keep building." Sophia absorbed this with visible relief, the specific unburdening of someone who had been carrying a harsher verdict on herself than the situation actually warranted. "Thank you," she said. "I needed to hear that framed that way, instead of just as a failure." "It's not a failure," Charlotte said. "It's a starting point. There's a difference, and I've spent a lot of my own career learning to see it clearly." Marcus Whitfield's transformation over the following months proved, to Charlotte's cautious but genuine satisfaction, considerably more sustained than the kind of temporary contrition that sometimes followed a single dramatic reckoning. He began, roughly 2 months after the ceremony, quietly restructuring several of his own long-standing assumptions about hospital hierarchy, soliciting input from junior nursing staff during clinical decisions in a way he'd rarely done before, acknowledging publicly when a nurse's observation changed his clinical assessment, and, in a detail that surprised several people who had known him for years, personally advocating for 2 other nurses with unconventional employment histories to be given expanded responsibilities he would once have automatically assumed they weren't qualified for. "I keep catching myself," he admitted to Charlotte, during one of their now regular collaborative conversations, roughly 4 months after the ceremony. "The old instinct, the reflexive certainty that my judgment doesn't benefit from outside input. It hasn't disappeared just because I've built better habits around catching it." "That's honest," Charlotte said, "and it matches something I'd have told you myself, months ago actually. I don't think the instinct fully disappears for most people. I think the goal is building enough awareness that it doesn't get to run the show unchecked. From what I've watched over these months, you've actually managed that, consistently, even on the days the old instinct tries to reassert itself." "That's a more generous assessment than I probably deserve," Whitfield said. "It's an accurate one," Charlotte said. "I don't need you to be perfect for the change to be real, Marcus. I need you to be consistently better than you were, and consistently accountable when you're not. That's what I've actually watched happen." Whitfield absorbed this with the particular gravity of someone genuinely moved by an assessment he hadn't fully expected to receive. "Thank you," he said, "for being honest instead of just being kind about it." "They're not mutually exclusive," Charlotte said. "Most things people assume are opposites usually aren't, if you look closely enough." Reyes's recovery, over the following months, progressed steadily, though the road back to full operational fitness proved longer and more difficult than his early optimism had initially suggested. He returned to Brennan Memorial periodically for follow-up appointments, and Charlotte made a point of finding time during those visits to check on him personally, a habit that had, over the months, evolved into something closer to genuine friendship than the professional courtesy either of them might have predicted during the chaos of that first afternoon. The physical therapy process proved considerably more grueling than Reyes had initially anticipated, requiring months of painstaking work to rebuild strength and mobility in the femoral repair site, and Charlotte, drawing on her own years of experience supporting wounded operators through exactly this kind of difficult recovery, offered guidance that extended well beyond her formal role, sitting with him through several of his more discouraging setbacks with the same patient, steady presence she brought to every difficult moment. "They're clearing me for a training command position," Reyes told her, during one such visit, 6 months after the initial crisis, his color considerably better than it had been in the ICU, though he still favored his left side slightly when he walked. Not full operational status. "Command doesn't think the abdomen and the femoral repair are ever going to be quite what they were before. But training incoming operators, running tactical medicine courses, that I can do." "That's good work," Charlotte said, genuinely pleased. "Important work. You'll be good at it." "Funny you'd say that," Reyes said, "since it was watching you do something similar with that new nurse of yours that actually convinced me to consider it in the first place. I stopped by last month, saw you working with her on a difficult case, and thought, that's not a lesser version of the job. That's just a different way of mattering." Charlotte felt something warm move through her chest, the specific, uncomplicated pride of watching someone she'd once fought to keep alive build something genuinely good out of the aftermath of nearly losing everything. "I'm glad it helped," she said, "even a little." "It helped a lot," Reyes said. "I spent the first few weeks after the surgery pretty convinced my career was basically over, in any form that mattered to me. Watching you find a version of the work that still felt like it mattered, even after everything you'd been through, that gave me somewhere to actually aim, instead of just grieving what I couldn't do anymore." "Grief and finding a new direction aren't mutually exclusive," Charlotte said. "I spent a long time thinking they were. They're not. You can carry both." "I'm learning that," Reyes said. "Slower than I'd like, but I'm learning it." They sat together for a while longer in the quiet of the hospital's courtyard, two people who had survived something together that very few people around them would ever fully understand. And when Reyes finally left, walking with his careful, healing gait toward the parking lot, Charlotte watched him go with the specific, settled satisfaction of someone who understood that some kinds of vindication weren't public ceremonies at all. Some of them were simply watching the people you'd fought to keep alive build something worth living for, slowly, in their own time, in their own way. Charlotte's own history, in the years before the Navy, had never been particularly remarkable. A middle-class upbringing in a mid-sized coastal town, a mother who worked as an elementary school teacher, and a father who ran a small hardware store, neither of them with any military background that might have explained her eventual path. She had been, by her own later account, a fairly ordinary teenager, more interested in swimming competitively and reading considerably more than her classmates than in any particular vision of her future career. The decision to enlist had come somewhat suddenly, in her last year of nursing school, driven by a combination of restlessness and a specific, stubborn conviction that she wanted to do something that tested her more directly than the civilian nursing career track she'd been quietly, comfortably drifting toward. Her parents had been startled by the decision, though ultimately supportive, and she had entered officer training with the same quiet, unflashy determination that would eventually come to define her entire career. Never the loudest person in any room, but consistently, reliably, the one whose judgment proved correct when it actually mattered. She had excelled quickly, distinguishing herself during her initial deployment cycle with the same combination of technical skill and unflappable composure that had characterized her work at Brennan Memorial, and had been selected, at 25, for the considerably more demanding role of trauma medicine liaison embedded directly with special operations units, a role that required not just clinical excellence, but the specific psychological resilience to operate in sustained close proximity to genuinely mortal risk, for extended deployment cycles, without either becoming desensitized to the stakes or so overwhelmed by them that the work itself suffered. She had managed that balance across 4 years with a consistency that had earned her a reputation within her platoon as someone whose calm was not performance, but genuine, hard-won discipline, the specific product of years spent deliberately building the capacity to function fully even when everything in a given moment argued for panic instead. 8 months after the initial crisis, Brennan Memorial faced an unrelated but equally demanding test, a multi-vehicle collision on the highway adjacent to the hospital during evening rush hour, generating a mass casualty event that pushed the hospital's ordinary emergency capacity toward its outer limits. Charlotte, now formally recognized as a resource for exactly this kind of high-acuity coordination following the events of 8 months earlier, found herself naturally stepping into a leadership role during the response, her calm, precise direction cutting through the initial chaos with the same trained clarity that had characterized every crisis she'd navigated since arriving at Brennan Memorial. Marcus Whitfield worked directly alongside her during the response, not as a reluctant subordinate, but as a genuine, collaborative partner. His clinical expertise integrated seamlessly into the coordination she was providing. "Your read on the triage sequencing is holding," he told her, roughly 90 minutes into the response, something like genuine admiration threading through his voice. "I've been running trauma surgery for 20 years, and I've never seen a mass casualty response handled with this little friction between clinical and coordination priorities." "It's not just coordination," Charlotte said. "It's trust. We're not fighting each other for authority anymore. That's the actual difference from 8 months ago." "That's fair," Whitfield said. "I think I needed to genuinely believe that before I could actually practice it, rather than just performing the belief because I understood it was expected of me now." "And do you," Charlotte asked, "genuinely believe it?" Whitfield considered the question seriously, even in the middle of an active crisis, the specific gravity of someone giving an honest answer rather than a convenient one. "I do," he said. "It took longer than I'd like to admit, but yes, I genuinely do." The collision response concluded 3 hours after activation, with outcomes that regional emergency management would later describe as considerably better than the hospital's prior mass casualty performance would have predicted. A result that both Charlotte and Whitfield understood, without needing to say it aloud to each other, traced directly back to the specific, hard-won transformation of their working relationship over the preceding 8 months. Sophia Renner, working her first genuinely severe mass casualty event, performed with a composure that surprised even her, catching a subtle presentation in one patient that could easily have been missed under less careful triage. "I kept thinking about what you told me," she said to Charlotte afterward, still processing the adrenaline of her first major crisis, "about uncertainty being information rather than disqualification. I wasn't sure about my read on that patient, but I flagged it anyway, and it turned out to matter." "That's exactly the instinct I was hoping you'd build," Charlotte said. "You did good work today, Sophia. Real work, under real pressure. Don't let anyone, including your own doubts, talk you out of trusting that." Sophia went on, over the following months, to become one of Brennan Memorial's most trusted junior nurses, her earlier uncertainty gradually replaced by the same quiet, hard-won confidence Charlotte had spent years modeling for her. She began, eventually, offering the newer nursing hires exactly the kind of encouragement Charlotte had once offered her. A small, steady chain of mentorship extending outward, each link built on the same fundamental lesson passed forward with only minor variations in how it happened to be phrased. Commander Cray returned to Brennan Memorial twice more over the following year, each visit driven by a combination of genuine coordination business, Reyes's ongoing case, the broader investigation into Volkov's network, and what had, over time, become something closer to a personal friendship that neither of them had fully anticipated when their paths reconnected during that first chaotic afternoon. During her second visit, Roughly 10 months after the initial crisis, Cray found Charlotte during a quiet evening shift, and the two of them ended up talking for nearly 2 hours in the hospital's courtyard, the specific ease of two people who had shared enough consequential history to skip past most of the careful social calibration that typically governed conversations between a commanding officer and a former subordinate. "I've been thinking about something," Cray said, partway through the conversation. "A proposal I want to run past you, though I want to be clear up front that I fully expect you might say no, and I won't push if that's your answer." "Go ahead," Charlotte said. "The Navy's building an advisory program," Cray said, "specifically designed to help medical liaisons transitioning out of embedded special operations roles navigate that transition more successfully than most of us managed on our own. I want you to consider serving as a consulting advisor, not full-time, not requiring you to step back into any formal capacity, but bringing your specific experience to bear on helping others navigate exactly the transition you went through." Charlotte considered this carefully, weighing the specific, complicated calculus of a life she had spent years building around a particular, hard-won equilibrium between her old expertise and her new civilian purpose. "I'd want it structured carefully," she said finally. "Limited scope, limited time commitment, and absolutely no scenario where it pulls me away from actual bedside patient care for more than a handful of days each quarter. That balance matters enormously to me, and I won't trade it away even for meaningful work." "I think that's entirely reasonable," Cray said. "And frankly, I think your insistence on maintaining that balance is exactly why you'd be valuable in this specific advisory role. You've actually built the integration you'd be teaching other people to build. That's considerably more credible than someone offering theoretical guidance they haven't personally tested." Charlotte thought about it for several more days before ultimately agreeing, negotiating the specific terms carefully to ensure the arrangement genuinely protected the balance she'd insisted on. The advisory role, once formalized, brought her into periodic contact with other former military medical personnel navigating their own transitions, each conversation drawing on the same fundamental lessons she'd learned but adapted to the specific circumstances of each new person she worked with. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, genuine satisfaction in the work. Not the same intensity of purpose that had defined her Navy years, and not quite the same immediate, tangible connection she felt during an ordinary bedside shift, but something that occupied a meaningful middle space between the two versions of purpose she'd spent years learning how to hold simultaneously, rather than treating as mutually exclusive. One of the first people she worked with through the advisory program was a former Army combat medic named Rachel Kowalski, struggling with almost exactly the kind of careful, guarded transition Charlotte herself had once navigated. Rachel had served 2 deployments before a training injury unrelated to combat had ended her active service earlier than she'd planned, leaving her with the specific, complicated grief of a career cut short by circumstance rather than choice, compounded by the same careful vagueness about her history that Charlotte recognized immediately from her own experience. "I don't know how to talk about it without either minimizing it or making it sound like I'm asking for special treatment," Rachel admitted, during their first conversation. "So mostly, I just don't talk about it at all, and I end up feeling like I'm hiding something, even though I'm not doing anything wrong." "I understand that exactly," Charlotte said. "I spent 2 years managing almost precisely that same tension. I don't think there's a perfect solution to it, honestly, but I found it helped to have a small number of trusted people who knew the full truth, even if the broader professional environment only ever got the careful, edited version." "How did you find those people?" Rachel asked. "Slowly," Charlotte said, "through consistent, reliable presence over time, mostly. Trust doesn't usually arrive quickly, especially around something this personal. I'd focus less on finding the perfect confidant right away, and more on simply being genuinely present and reliable with the people around you. The right trust tends to develop naturally out of that, eventually." Rachel absorbed this with visible relief. The specific unburdening of someone who had been carrying an isolating uncertainty for longer than she'd fully admitted even to herself. "Thank you," she said. "I think I needed to hear that from someone who'd actually lived through it, rather than just read about it in a transition guide." "That's most of what this program is actually for," Charlotte said. "Not new information, just someone who's actually been there, saying the thing out loud that you already suspected but needed confirmed." Rachel went on, over the following months, to complete a successful transition into civilian trauma nursing at a hospital several states away, and the two women maintained an occasional correspondence that Charlotte found genuinely rewarding. A small, ongoing thread of connection to the broader community of people navigating exactly the kind of transition she herself had once made without any comparable guidance available to her. Marcus Whitfield's own history, which Charlotte learned in careful pieces over the following months of genuine collaborative friendship, offered her a considerably more complete understanding of exactly why his initial reflexive dismissal had run so deep, and why his subsequent transformation, once it began, had proven so genuinely sustained rather than merely performative. He had trained, early in his career, under an attending physician whose management style had been built almost entirely around rigid hierarchy and public correction, a man who had made junior doctors and nurses alike feel, consistently, that competence needed to be proven repeatedly rather than simply trusted once demonstrated. Whitfield had spent years quietly resenting that treatment, promising himself he would never replicate it, and had, in the specific way people sometimes do without fully recognizing the pattern, become a slightly gentler but structurally similar version of exactly that same rigid hierarchy anyway, convinced, the entire time, that his own version was different, more justified, more directly connected to patient safety than his old mentor's harshness had ever genuinely been. "I used to think I was protecting patients by trusting my own judgment above input from staff. I considered less qualified," he told Charlotte, during one of their now regular evening conversations, several months after the ceremony. "I've come to understand, slowly, that I was actually protecting my own sense of authority and telling myself a story about patient safety to make that protection feel more justified than it actually was. That's a difficult thing to recognize about yourself," Charlotte said. "It took watching my own protocol fail in exactly the way you predicted, and watching your alternative assessment succeed in exactly the way your training had prepared you to anticipate," Whitfield said. "I don't think I would have gotten there on my own, honestly. I needed the specific, undeniable evidence, not an abstract argument about bias and hierarchy." "I think that's true for a lot of people," Charlotte said. "I don't think most institutional change happens through people simply being convinced by better arguments. It happens through people encountering evidence specific and undeniable enough that their old assumptions simply can't survive contact with it." "Is that discouraging?" Whitfield asked. "That it takes something that dramatic to actually shift deeply held assumptions?" Charlotte considered this for a long moment. "Sometimes," she admitted. "I'd prefer a version of institutional change that didn't require an actual crisis to force the issue. But I've also learned, over years of watching how slowly most meaningful change actually happens, that I'd rather take the change however it genuinely arrives than hold out for some cleaner, more reasonable version that might never actually materialize." A year after the initial crisis, Whitfield approached Charlotte with a proposal of his own, a formal, structured mentorship program he wanted to establish at Brennan Memorial, specifically designed to help junior nursing staff develop the confidence to voice clinical observations without fear of dismissal, modeled explicitly on the lessons he'd learned through his own difficult reckoning. "I want you involved in designing it," he told her. "Not as a token gesture, but because you're the person who actually knows what this looks like when it works well, from years of experience I don't have access to on my own." Charlotte considered the proposal carefully, recognizing in it something genuinely different from the performative gestures that sometimes followed institutional embarrassment. A specific, sustained commitment to building something that would outlast the particular circumstances that had prompted it. "I'll help," she said, "on the condition that it's not just about my story specifically. I don't want this to become a program that only makes sense in the context of one dramatic incident. I want it to be genuinely useful for the ordinary, unglamorous work of building better communication between staff at every level, regardless of whether any individual case ever becomes dramatic." "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say," Whitfield said. "I don't want this to be a monument to one difficult morning. I want it to be a genuine, lasting improvement to how this hospital actually functions." The program, once developed, drew on both Charlotte's operational training and Whitfield's own hard-won institutional insight, and within its first year had measurably improved several key metrics related to error catching and clinical communication across Brennan Memorial's various departments, a result that drew formal recognition from regional healthcare quality assessment boards and, more meaningfully to both Charlotte and Whitfield, a steady stream of junior staff who reported feeling genuinely more confident voicing clinical concerns than they had before the program's implementation. Several other regional hospitals, hearing about the program's success through professional networks, reached out over the following year, requesting guidance on implementing similar structures within their own institutions, and Charlotte found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, becoming a genuine resource within the broader regional healthcare community, not through any dramatic public visibility, but through the specific, steady accumulation of institutions, recognizing that the program she'd helped build actually worked, consistently, in ways that mattered to their own staff and patients. 18 months after the initial crisis, exactly as long as she had spent building her careful civilian anonymity before Reyes's arrival forced everything into the open, Charlotte received an unexpected letter, forwarded through Commander Cray's office, from the mother of another operator she had once served alongside, a young man named Elias Frost who had survived his deployment, but had, tragically, died 2 years after leaving active service in circumstances entirely unrelated to his military career. The letter was brief, warm, and carried a specific, generous grace that moved Charlotte considerably more than she'd expected. Elias's mother wrote that she had read, through informal channels within the veteran community, about Charlotte's story, the hospital crisis, the medal, the specific, quiet dedication that had apparently defined her entire service. She wanted Charlotte to know that Elias had spoken of her often, describing her, in his mother's words, as "the reason I made it home to see you all again," and that the family had always hoped for a chance to properly thank her, a chance that had never quite materialized before Elias's own untimely death. "I know this letter arrives strangely, connected to grief that isn't directly about the crisis you just went through," the letter read. "But I wanted you to know that the impact of your service didn't end with any single mission. It rippled forward into years my son got to have with us, years I know he was deeply grateful for, even though he's no longer here to say so himself. Thank you. For whatever that's worth, all this time later." Charlotte read the letter alone in her apartment and found herself, for the second time in 18 months, genuinely moved to tears by an unexpected piece of grace from someone whose grief connected, however indirectly, to her own service. She wrote back carefully, over several days, sharing memories of Elias from their deployment together, small details that had never made it into any official record, and found, in the specific act of putting those memories into words for his grieving mother, a renewed appreciation for the full scope of what her service had actually meant. Not just the dramatic moments that had eventually made her a public story, but the countless quieter ones that had simply, steadily kept people alive long enough to build entire additional years of ordinary, precious life. On a quiet Tuesday morning, 18 months after Marcus Whitfield had told her to step aside in a trauma bay where her clinical assessment would prove critical to preventing a preventable death, Charlotte Hale walked into Brennan Memorial Hospital at the start of her shift, checked her assignments, and began, once again, the quiet, essential work that had always been the truest core of who she was, regardless of whatever additional responsibilities and recognition had accumulated around it over the preceding year and a half. Her first patient that morning was a teenager, brought in after a minor sports injury, frightened and trying hard not to show it, more worried about missing an upcoming competition than about the sprained ankle that had brought her to the ER. Charlotte sat with her for a few extra minutes, the same unhurried, steady patience she brought to every frightened patient, regardless of the scale of what had brought them through the doors, and by the time she moved on to her next assignment, the teenager was laughing at one of her deliberately gentle jokes. The specific tension that had gripped her shoulders when she first arrived visibly loosened. It did not matter to Charlotte in the end which kind of patient was in front of her. It never had. That had always been the whole of it, the entire, uncomplicated truth underneath every uniform and every classified designation and every quiet civilian disguise she had ever needed to wear. She showed up. She paid attention. She did the work in front of her, one patient at a time, because that had never stopped being the whole of who she was, underneath every name and every rank she'd ever needed to carry it. Marcus Whitfield passed her in the hallway on his way to a morning consult, and instead of the reflexive dismissiveness that had once characterized nearly every interaction between them, he simply nodded, a small, genuine acknowledgement between colleagues and, increasingly, friends who had weathered something significant together and come out the other side with a considerably more honest understanding of each other. "Morning, Lieutenant," he said, and the rank, which had once landed in that hospital's trauma bay like a detonation, now carried nothing more than simple, settled fact. The way a title settles into a place, once everyone in the building has finally, fully understood what it actually represents. "Morning, Marcus," Charlotte said, using his first name with the specific ease of genuine friendship rather than formal professional distance, and continued down the hall toward her first patient of the day, her golden blonde hair catching the fluorescent light, her pace unhurried, her attention already, entirely, on the work in front of her. She thought, sometimes, on quiet mornings like this one, about the specific arc that had brought her to exactly this point. 7 years of Navy service that had cost her more than she'd fully understood at the time. 2 years of careful civilian anonymity that had offered real but incomplete peace, and then a single extraordinary afternoon that had forced her, in the space of hours, to finally stop keeping the two halves of her history artificially separate. She thought about Diego Salazar, about the specific weight of a mission that had never been her fault but that she had carried, for years, as though it might have been. She thought about Priya Anand's generous letter and the photograph now tucked behind her hospital badge, about Elias Frost's mother reaching across years of grief to offer an unexpected gift of gratitude. She thought about the slow, cumulative process of finally receiving confirmation from exactly the right sources that she had done everything reasonably possible during years of service that had cost her more than most people would ever fully understand. She thought about Sophia Renner and Rachel Kowalski, about the specific kind of legacy that mattered to her considerably more than any medal or formal recognition. The particular satisfaction of watching competence and confidence spread outward from a single difficult morning into something that would likely outlast her own individual presence at Brennan Memorial by decades. She thought about Marcus Whitfield, about the specific, sustained work of genuine institutional change, about how rarely such change happened easily or gracefully, and about how genuinely proud she'd become, over 18 months of watching him work, of a colleague who had faced the full weight of his own worst professional moment and chosen, consistently, to become someone measurably better in its aftermath. She was not, in the end, a legend, Whatever the hospital's ongoing institutional memory had eventually made of her story in the year and a half since that first extraordinary afternoon, she was a nurse, and, increasingly, something more than that, a mentor and advisor whose expertise now extended well beyond Brennan Memorial's walls. But underneath every additional title and every accumulated responsibility, she remained, fundamentally, exactly what she had always been, someone who believed, without complication, that the person in front of her mattered, that their survival was worth whatever it cost her personally to secure it, and that this commitment had never once required anyone else's permission or anyone else's belief in her competence to be genuinely, permanently true. Marcus Whitfield understood that now, in a way he hadn't 18 months earlier, when he'd looked at a quiet, capable nurse with golden blonde hair and clear, steady blue eyes, and decided, without ever actually examining the assumption, that she was simply someone who needed to step aside, unqualified to offer meaningful input in a room where consequential decisions were being made. He understood, watching her walk down that hallway on an ordinary Tuesday morning, exactly how much he had missed during those first 2 years, and exactly how much he still had left to learn from a woman who had never once needed his approval, or anyone else's, to know precisely who she was. Somewhere, in a formal Navy record that captured only a fraction of the full weight of what she'd actually done across 7 years of service in 2 entirely different but equally genuine capacities, the citation for her Navy Commendation Medal sat quietly alongside a considerably longer, mostly unwritten history. The mission that had cost her Diego Salazar. The years of careful civilian rebuilding that followed, the single extraordinary afternoon that had forced everything back into the open, and the 18 months since that had, patiently, deliberately, woven both halves of her history into something considerably more whole than either version alone had ever managed to be. No single document would ever capture the entirety of who Charlotte Hale actually was. No document ever could. But the people who had watched her step back into that trauma bay after being told to step aside, correctly identify an injury that would have cost a man his life, and then, hours later, disarm an armed intruder in a hospital corridor without a single moment's hesitation, they knew. They would carry that knowledge with them for the rest of their careers, the specific, permanent understanding that competence rarely announces itself through appearance or first impression alone, that the quietest, most unassuming person in the room is sometimes exactly the person capable of holding everyone else steady when the crisis finally arrives, and that the words, "step aside," would never again, in that hospital, be spoken to her by anyone who had actually taken the time to watch her work. 2 years after the initial crisis, Charlotte received a final, unexpected piece of closure connected to her Navy years, a formal notification that the intelligence failure responsible for the specific mission that had cost Diego Salazar his life had, following an extensive internal review, prompted partly by the visibility her own story had generated within military circles, been definitively traced to a compromised planning cell rather than any operational error on the part of the medical or tactical teams involved. The notification arrived through official channels, considerably more bureaucratic in tone than the personal correspondence she'd received from Priya or Elias Frost's mother, but it carried, underneath its formal language, a specific weight that mattered to Charlotte more than she'd fully anticipated: the institutional confirmation, finally, of something she had privately believed for years but had never been able to formally verify. She called Commander Cray the evening the notification arrived, needing to share the news with someone who would fully understand its significance without requiring extensive context. "I always suspected it," Charlotte told her. "The mission's plan had gaps that didn't make sense given the intelligence we were supposedly working from. But suspecting something and having it formally confirmed are different experiences entirely." "They are," Cray agreed. "I'm glad you finally have the confirmation. You've carried that uncertainty for a long time, longer than you should have had to." I keep thinking about how differently things might have gone if this confirmation had arrived years earlier, Charlotte said. Whether I'd have made the same choice to separate from active duty, or whether I'd have stayed, fighting for accountability through official channels instead. You'll never know the answer to that, Cray said. But I think the version of events that actually happened, you building something new at Brennan Memorial, eventually finding your way back to a version of this work that includes both halves of who you are, I think that version carries its own kind of rightness to it. Sometimes the path that looks like a departure from your old life turns out to be exactly what makes the old life's unfinished business finally resolvable. Charlotte considered this for a long moment. The specific, settled peace of someone finally allowing a difficult chapter of her history to close properly, rather than remaining permanently, quietly unresolved. I think you're right, she said. I think I needed both halves of this, the Navy years and the civilian life after, to actually get to this specific moment of peace. Neither one alone would have gotten me here. She thought, in the days following that notification, about writing to Diego Salazar's fiancée Priya once more, sharing this final piece of confirmation, but ultimately decided the news belonged, first, to a quieter, more private processing before she was ready to share it further. She spent that particular evening alone, sitting with the specific, complicated relief of finally, fully closing a chapter she had carried, unresolved, for considerably longer than she'd let herself fully acknowledge. A relief that arrived not with dramatic emotion, but with the same quiet, steady composure that had defined nearly everything meaningful in her life, before and after the Navy alike. On a quiet Tuesday morning, 2 years after Marcus Whitfield had told her to step aside in a trauma bay where her clinical assessment would prove critical to preventing a preventable death, Charlotte Hale walked into Brennan Memorial Hospital at the start of her shift, checked her assignments, and began, once again, the quiet, essential work that had always been the truest core of who she was, regardless of whatever additional responsibilities and recognition had accumulated around it over the preceding 2 years. She thought, on this particular morning, about how much had changed since that first extraordinary afternoon, and how much, at the same time, had genuinely stayed the same. The specific, essential work of showing up for whoever needed her that day, unchanged beneath every additional layer of history, recognition, and hard-won institutional respect that had accumulated around it. She still ran the same morning routine, still swam most mornings at the same community pool, still carried Diego Salazar's photograph tucked behind her hospital badge, a quiet, private thread connecting every ordinary shift to the considerably less ordinary years that had shaped the medic she'd become. Sophia Renner, now fully confident in her own clinical judgment, passed her in the hallway that morning and offered a quick, warm greeting before continuing toward her own patients. A small, ordinary moment that carried, underneath its simplicity, the specific satisfaction of watching mentorship take root and grow into genuine, independent competence. Marcus Whitfield found her during a brief lull between patients, carrying 2 cups of coffee, one of which he handed to her with the easy familiarity of genuine friendship. "Big day?" he asked, settling into the specific, comfortable rhythm that had come to define most of their interactions over the preceding 2 years. "Ordinary day," Charlotte said, accepting the coffee, "which is its own kind of good, most mornings." "I'll take ordinary," Whitfield said. "We've had enough of the other kind to last a while." They stood together for a few minutes in comfortable silence, 2 colleagues who had weathered something extraordinary together and settled, in its aftermath, into the specific, sustainable rhythm of an ordinary working partnership built on hard-won mutual respect. Then Charlotte's pager buzzed, calling her toward her next patient, and she set down her coffee, straightened her scrubs, and walked toward the trauma bay with the same unhurried, steady competence that had defined every version of herself she had ever needed to be: the SEAL platoon's trusted medic, the quiet civilian nurse, the decorated lieutenant, and, underneath all of it, simply someone who believed, without complication, that the person in front of her mattered, and that showing up for them was always, in the end, more than enough.